Welcome to the Len Guillot Podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Casey Michel. Casey is an investigative journalist, and today we will speak about his book, American Kleptocracy: How the United States Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History. Casey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Alan. Very happy to be here.
So, Casey, as I told you a minute ago, I'm from Colombia, and uh, being that I come from a country that produces drugs and exports those drugs to the United States, I have always been hearing these cowboy stories of drug dealers and the counterpart, which is the money laundering part. How does the drug dealers launder all these millions of dollars? But, when you see everything on the internet, you don't know how much is fiction, how much is true, how much is distorted. So that's why I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, because I think I will get closer to the truth. But before we get to the topic of the book, can you tell us a little bit about your background? I mean, how do you get, first of all, into journalism? And then how is it that you got interested in this subject in particular, which is money laundering?
Yeah, Alan, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with you today. And you're exactly right that these networks of money launderers, all these individuals, all these groups, these organizations that are profiting from things like drug trafficking or arms trafficking or human trafficking, so much of this requires not just the actual networks on the ground, the actual contraband, the actual drugs or the products, but the ability to then launder that money, transform that money from dirty money to clean money. That is really what money laundering is at the very core. It's the simple transformation of dirty or illicit or suspect wealth gained from things like drug trafficking or arms trafficking or human trafficking, and transform that into clean, legitimate assets, money that can't be traced to its initial illicit source. Things like property, things like investments, things like, in certain cases, artwork or high-end memorabilia collection that can never be tracked back to its initial source. So when we're talking about money laundering today, that's really what I'm talking about. But Alan, me personally, I, as listeners may be able to tell, I am an American. My thick American accent is coming through today. I have been working as a journalist in the United States for almost a decade now, and I've been covering international money laundering networks for years and years. Some of that is drug trafficking, some of that is arms trafficking, much of that is also related to dictatorships, authoritarian governments, kleptocratic governments. Again, these are figures and regimes and dictators that are dedicated not to democracy, not to reform, but only to profiting from their position, controlling the levers of state power, controlling access to the state budget so they can profit, their families can profit, their friends can profit, and entire countries, entire populations end up so much worse because of these regimes. This is a topic I have been working on and covering and writing on for outlets in the US for years and years. And one thing became very clear a few years ago, and that's why this book exists. It's that money laundering, and as we write about kleptocracy, which is really international money laundering from these figures in power, and as well as from these cartel networks and human trafficking networks, it doesn't exist in just one country. These money laundering networks are not just in one country or one area or one jurisdiction. They are international. They are transnational. And so often what I have seen, other researchers have seen, other investigators have seen, is that it's not these traditional offshore finance or financial secrecy havens that we may think of, Switzerland or Panama or the Cayman Islands. Now, the biggest offshore haven, the biggest source of money laundering tools and services is the United States of America. And we can talk a little bit about why that is, but that's really what my book is arguing. That's what my book is revealing. It's that when you have any dirty money, the best place you can come to is not Switzerland or Panama or some of these older offshore havens. It's now the United States of America.
Well, I do have a million questions about it and about how the financial system works in order to enable these money laundering schemes. But I'm going to share with you how Colombia's money launderers work. I mean, one scheme that I know of, I'm sure there are many, But as far as I know, whenever they sell the drugs in the United States, they don't repatriate that cash money. They buy computer equipment, cell phones, electronics. Now they buy, I don't know, $1 million in iPhones, for example, from a legitimate company. They export those iPhones to Colombia, and then they sell it in regular stores, and that cash money that comes in clean money from regular Joe Blows that buy an iPhone in the streets. And of course, since they don't have to make a profit on that, they can sell that a little bit below value, so they get the whole market. And oh, I'm gonna buy an iPhone from Joe Vasquez because he's a money launderer, and I can get those iPhones for less money.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Alan. And I don't write about Colombia in particular in the book because what I'm writing about are these international networks that take place all around the world. The example from Colombia is so fascinating because, again, obviously so much of it is focused on the drug trade and drug trafficking. And when you go back 30, 40 years ago, to the era of Pablo Escobar and Cali Cartel, et cetera, so much of modern money laundering right now, it follows the same dynamics. It follows the same patterns that we saw, especially in 1980s, 1990s, Colombian drug trafficking or Panamanian drug trafficking, or obviously now Venezuelan drug trafficking, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same networks. It's the same dynamics. What you just mentioned a moment ago, Alan, was this system where they set up these illegitimate companies, these fake companies. What I write about in the book are shell companies, which are also these really fake companies. They exist only on paper. You don't know who controls them. You don't know what product they sell. And very often, they're not meant for a profit. And what you just said is one way you can do that is use this shell company to hide ownership, to hide where that money is actually coming from, and to create this import-export scheme where you have iPhones or computers or any technology. It doesn't have to be technology. It can be arms trafficking. It can be human trafficking. It can be any product whatsoever to hide where that money is coming from, where it's going, who controls it. And unfortunately, the United States of America spent years and years, really decades, perfecting the art of the anonymous shell company. That is to say, the United States of America was the world's biggest provider of these anonymous companies, these fake companies that exist only on paper, so that Colombian cartels or Russian organized crime or Chinese fentanyl dealers or people from regimes in Angola or Malaysia or Kazakhstan can use these companies to hide their money, hide their wealth, and transform that into legitimate assets. You can't track it back to the original illicit source. But I will say, Alan, to your point, it is so remarkable. And maybe this is the next book, maybe this is another book, because the model we saw in Colombia 30, 40 years ago about how to transform that money, especially in the United States, really did set a pattern for what we have seen ever since, no longer just in Colombia, but obviously around the world now as well.
Okay, well, when people think about money laundering and offshore tax haven and whatever, or secrecy, of course, the first image that comes to their mind is Bahamas, Cayman Island, Belize, Bermuda, and all these countries where a person will probably have to show up in person, open an account, and then do all their money transferring from one bank to the other. But then the question is, how is it that the United States took unaware to beyond to all of us this place of leadership? I mean, definitely it's not the first place that comes to my mind when I think about money laundering.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Alan. And so many people, when they think of money laundering, they think of Bahamas, they think of Bermuda, they think of Panama, they think maybe of Switzerland or smaller areas elsewhere, small islands. They don't think of the United States, which is why I wrote my book, to really reveal that the United States has transformed into the world's biggest offshore haven. And the answer to your question is relatively simple, Alan. The United States, not necessarily the federal government. Remember, the United States is 50 different states. It's a federal country. All of the states still have specific rights. They have specific sovereign abilities. And American states can create their own financial architecture, their own financial services. So when I'm talking about this transformation, it's not always the federal government in Washington. It is smaller American states, places like Delaware, places like Nevada, places like Wyoming, places like South Dakota, that most people don't even think of. But what we saw is that legislators in Delaware, in Wyoming, in Nevada, in South Dakota, they realized that Bermuda, Bahamas, Cayman Islands, Panama were profiting so much from these laundering networks. They were profiting so much from all of this illicit, illegal wealth coming into the country. They realized that there's no reason the United States of America can't do the same. And remember, these are smaller states. They don't have much natural resources. They don't have much other economic opportunity. And what they realized in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s, they can set up the same systems that we see in Bahamas, in Bermuda, in Cayman Islands, in Panama. And they can do that with even more protections, even more financial secrecy, even more private property rights. Because again, the United States of America is still obviously a rule of law jurisdiction. Private property rights are still very strong in this country. There's still an independent judiciary. And oh, by the way, the United States is so much larger as well than these other jurisdictions that it can simply invite in so much more wealth. So you have similar systems, similar dynamics built in these states like Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, South Dakota. And you also have a far bigger size and scope and scale of the United States. So again, these are developments that are not unique to the United States. We see this again in Panama, in Bermuda, in Bahamas. But the United States of America followed that pattern and is now so much bigger. I mean, it's always been so much bigger that it can simply invite in so much more money. And it has been doing so for years and years and years without the reputation of Panama, of Bermuda, of Bahamas. I was talking with one investigator about why Delaware. Why Delaware has become the home for so many of these anonymous shell companies, so much of these money laundering networks. And he said, it's interesting. There are many reasons, but one reason is that Delaware does not have the reputation that the Cayman Islands or Bahamas or Bermuda does. So even if an investigator comes across a Delaware shell company or a Wyoming shell company or a Nevada shell company, there's no suspicion. There's no questioning. Now, hopefully that will change moving forward. But there are all these different dynamics that allow the United States to transform. And this is only about shell companies. There are other industries, there are other policies that also help that transformation come.
Well, my biggest confusion comes from this. Isn't the banking system federally regulated? I mean, that to my mind, that would mean the same set of laws for all banks. I mean, the Citibank in New York would be the same as the Citibank in Delaware, wouldn't it be?
Yes, you're exactly right, Alan. This is one of the stories that I write about in the book. One of the actual success stories in the United States when it comes to clamping down on and ending these money laundering networks. Because again, there are officials in Washington that realize this is a problem and are trying to do something about it. The clearest success story was 20 years ago when there was one piece of legislation in Washington called the Patriot Act, which has a lot of other issues about it. But the clearest success from that was that finally, in 2001, 2002, finally, the United States government required American banks to know who they were working with. It required American banks to no longer use the proceeds of foreign corruption, no longer work with narco traffickers, no longer work with arms traffickers, no longer work with anyone with dirty money. It set up a regulatory oversight regime. It required transparency for American banks to know who they were working with. And on paper, it's a very clear success story. It absolutely is. But there are two problems with it. One, the first issue is simply resourcing. So American banks, if they have a suspicion about a customer, they file what is called a suspicious activity report with the federal government. They alert the federal government that maybe this client is a narco trafficker, is an arms trafficker, is a dictator's son, so on and so forth. They file that paperwork with the federal government, but that doesn't mean they have to stop working with that client. They can continue working with that client. All they have to do is file the paperwork with the federal government. And unfortunately, over the last 20 years, the regulators in Washington have had so little resourcing, not nearly enough funding, not nearly enough people to actually monitor all of these filings that come in. So the paperwork keeps building and building and building, and there aren't enough people to actually look through. That's one issue. The other issue is that even though 20 years ago the American banking sector was, at least on paper, cleaned up, that piece of legislation called the Patriot Act, which targeted American banks, it also targeted other American industries that were taking part in these money laundering networks. It targeted American real estate. It targeted things like American private equity and hedge funds, these big private investment funds. It targeted other areas of American industry that were profiting, that we know now and we knew then were profiting from money laundering networks. But the problem is, soon after this legislation was passed, the American Treasury Department issued an exemption for real estate, for private equity, for hedge funds. The American Treasury Department said, look, we recognize that this new legislation requires anti-money laundering policies for things like American real estate, but we are worried that it will damage the industry, and we want to study the actual effects on the industry. So what the Treasury Department did is say, we will not require implementation of these new anti-money laundering requirements. It will be, this is the best part, Alan. The Treasury Department said it will be a temporary measure. Temporary, to my mind, temporary means maybe 1 month or maybe even 1 year. The Treasury Department said American real estate, American private equity, all these other industries, temporary exemption to study the issue. Now, Alan, it's been 20 years of this temporary exemption. I don't think that is what temporary means. It has been 20 years, and what we have seen since is even though the banking sector, again, is this relative success story, American real estate, American private equity, American hedge funds, the American art market, the American auction house market, the American luxury goods market, all of them have exploded into industries built on money laundering, profiting from money laundering, allowing money laundering, because again, these industries have no requirement whatsoever to check the source of income. They have no requirement whatsoever to identify who they're working with. So if you're a narco trafficker, arms trafficker, human trafficker, you can go to an American bank and you might be okay, or you might be caught, or you can just pay cash for American property in American auction houses, investing all of that cash in American private equity as much as you want with no questions asked whatsoever. And again, these industries have exploded in size on the one hand, but also as sources for all of this money laundering.
Okay, well, I'm going to create a hypothetical scenario that may be closer to the truth. Who knows? But imagine that I am a Mexican living in Tijuana. I know that if I can go to Texas, I can buy as many guns as I want to, no questions asked. Here is your 50 R-15, whatever hunting rifle that you want. I climb the Trump wall and take those weapons back to Tijuana and sell them for 3 times the price. Now I have this whole bunch of cash. And I heard that if I put that money in the Standard & Poor's 500, I can get an 8% return on my money. So now that I'm stuck there, what can I do with, I don't know, my $1 million that I want to now invest in the Standard & Poor's 500?
So this is the other thing that we haven't talked about. I write about this in the book a lot, but this is the other element that we haven't talked about yet, Alan. Because you do have this success, relative success in the banking sector. You have this very clear failure for real estate, for investments, for the art market, for auction houses. But there's one other element that has played one of the key roles in creating this transformation in the United States. And this is the American legal sector. These are American lawyers and American law firms. So as a bit of background, American lawyers, American law firms have never, ever had any requirements to check the source of income, to check if their clients are narco traffickers, are kleptocrats, are dictators. They've never had to check any of that. There's been no requirement, no limitation. And when you're in the court of law, that's fine. Everybody is due equal rights in the court of law. But what we have seen over the past decade, the past 2 decades, the past 3 decades, is that American lawyers and American law firms no longer just represent people in court. Now, what we have seen, they are the ones who set up the shell companies. They are the ones who set up the investments. They are the ones who set up the financial networks or the meetings with the real estate agents or the actual auction house purchases, et cetera, et cetera. So to answer your question, Alan, if you are a Mexican national in Tijuana and you have $1 million in dirty money and you want to inject it into the American economy, the best thing you can do, the easiest thing you can do, and the smartest thing you can do, and I hopefully no narco traffickers are listening because it's so easy. All you have to do is hire an American lawyer, hire an American law firm, because they will be the best friend that you can ask for. Because again, they have no requirements to check where you got your money. They have no limitations on what they can do for you. They are, again, the best friends that you can ask for. They are the ones that set up the shell companies. They are the ones that set up the investments. They are the ones that set up the purchases. And there's one other thing that they can do. Well, there's many other things they can do. One other thing is they can target and intimidate investigative journalists who are asking questions. But there's another specific element. I know we just talked about the success of the banking sector, but lawyers have their own bank accounts. Law firms have their own bank accounts. And what we have seen is they are perfectly happy to take that dirty money from their client, put it in their own bank account. The bank doesn't have to ask any questions about that money. They know the lawyer is controlling it, but they don't have to ask questions about that specific part of the lawyer account. And all of a sudden, that money is now in the banking sector. All it has to do is move out to whatever they needed to do. So this is what I'm talking about. It is so easy for this to happen. And so it's no surprise that we have seen this dynamic, this phenomenon explode in the last decade or two.
Wow, you just blew my mind. I thought it would be more complicated than that.
It's not. It's
okay,
not.
well, then, of course, you mentioned some amazing cases in your book. They are worthy of each one of them of a movie because they are in part unbelievable, but also very creative. But I give you an example. Okay, my cousins in Colombia, one of them have a barbershop, the other have an alarm company, and the other one has a hair salon. Okay, this is clean money, and they would like to put that money. We don't have a stock market in Colombia. Okay, so and we have inflation of huge amount of inflation. So their money will be deteriorated if you just put it in their banking system there. And we don't have a stock market in Colombia. So, and this is clean money, but they needed to put it to work somewhere. So, I mean, I'll be advising them to bring it to the United States. It's totally legal. They are not hiding their money. And I guess in a way, this banking system, all the money that they have is not dirty money. There's millions of Colombians or Argentinians or Uruguayans who don't have an efficient financial sector, and they need United States, Canada, or England to take care of that money.
Yeah. You're exactly right, Alan. And this is what I write about in the book also, is that this globalization of the creation of this global economy, the ease of access to moving money, to investing money. So often all you need is a computer and the click of a button, and you can move the money, you can move the assets across borders, across hemispheres, across industries. But the problem, among all of the other issues, the problem is that the dirty money, and as you were just talking about, the clean money, they follow the exact same pathways. They follow the exact same dynamics, and they end up being mixed together with one another. So this is really again, there are so many issues, but at the end of the day, the biggest issue is that it is so difficult to disentangle, to identify dirty money versus clean money, because they follow the exact same pathways. They follow the exact same dynamic. So again, Alan, to your question, yes, your cousin and your friends, they can invest their own funds in the American stock market or American investments, or they can do the same thing the narco traffickers do. They can hire an American lawyer. They can have the American lawyers set up the shell companies. They can have the American lawyers set up other investments. Again, it's the exact same phenomenon, the exact same dynamic, because the lawyers in the U.S. have no requirement to check who they are working with. Anybody and everybody, you, me, my parents, my wife, your family, we can all use these same systems. And so it's no surprise that the global criminals, organized criminals, again, I keep saying narco traffickers, armed traffickers, human traffickers, everyone is using these same financial pathways, these same financial flows. And again, in the United States, so many industries are profiting. The lawyers are profiting. The real estate industry is profiting. Private equity, hedge funds, the art market, they're all profiting. So they have no incentive to stop any of this. It's not until journalists, conversation makers like yourself, policymakers in Washington and elsewhere finally begin realizing what a problem this is and implementing policies. Until that happens, these systems will just continue and will continue to grow.
Okay, well, my last question is, where does the United States get the moral standing to wag their fingers to other little countries and say, oh, you guys are money launderers, you shouldn't be doing that, and we have to break your secrecy laws, when at the same time they are the biggest money launderers in the whole planet?
Yeah, I mean, Alan, that's such a great question. The short answer is there is no moral standing whatsoever. The United States, yes, it has been a leader in certain anti-corruption policies. It was the first country to criminalize bribing foreign officials. It was the first country to specifically identify money laundering as a crime. It was the first country to create a specific Department of Justice task force to go after illicit wealth in the United States. There are elements and legacies of leadership, but at the end of the day, there is no claim for moral standing whatsoever. So that's the short answer. The slightly longer answer is that finally, only in the last year, finally, the United States government, the federal government, not the state government, but the federal government is finally realizing just what transformation has taken place in the United States. Just last month, the United States Secretary of Treasury finally said for the first time that the United States is probably the best place in the world to hide illicit money, to transform dirty money into clean money. It's only in the last month that the American government is finally realizing this transformation has taken place. And I do know in conversations that the current administration, the Biden administration, is actually finally becoming aware of this phenomenon and realizing there is no moral standing, realizing that the United States needs to have far, far more humility when it is speaking with foreign partners, when it is speaking with counterparts in places like Colombia or in places like, you name it, elsewhere. Only recently is that really beginning to transform. Now, it's early, that can change. Who knows what will happen if Donald Trump is president again in a few years. It's a very interesting and dynamic time in the United States, but hopefully that realization continues, because the United States government has to be more humble, has to have more humility with foreign partners if there is ever going to be success cleaning up not only the United States itself, but these international networks that have been building and building and building for years and years. So I am optimistic about where things are going, but again, it's a situation that could change if Trump is president. It's a situation we have to continue watching moving forward.
Okay, see, I had to tell you, your book should be made into a documentary, because it's so full of interesting stories and things that are controlled, who blows my mind, in the cases that you are revealing. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing.
Absolutely, Alan. The title of the book is American Kleptocracy, How the U.S. Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History. You can see that I'm reading it right next to me. And it is available in bookstores. It is available online. If you would like to follow me, my website is caseymichelle.com. I have a Twitter. I have, again, a regular website, a website that's regularly updated. And, the good news about international money laundering is that it's not going away anytime soon. It will be with us for years and years to come. Maybe that's not good news, all things considered, but certainly for those of us working in this world, it is going to stay with us and become only more relevant in years to come. So, Alan, muchísimas gracias para todos. This has been absolutely wonderful, and I just want to thank you again for giving me the time to talk about some of these topics.
Well, thank you so much, Casey.